What is a countertenor?
What is a countertenor? Gee whiz, I'm asked that question all the time. Have over the many, many, many years. In fact, years and years ago, a very famous composer and conductor who will go nameless because he was a very musically educated person, asked me, is a countertenor the same thing as a castrato? I said, oh no, they're very, very different. But in my own case, I've always sung with my naturally placed high tenor voice. Now, the vast majority, and I could almost say 99%, if not 100%, of the countertenors singing today are using their falsetto voices. What is the falsetto voice? Well, it's a muscular adjustment that one makes in the throat. Singers know how to do that. Every man has a falsetto voice if he chooses to make use of it, but to develop a cultivated, refined singing voice using your falsetto production is quite another matter. And the ones who are singing today are absolutely wonderful and do very, very well with it. It's just a difference. I never sang using my falsetto voice. I was just always a naturally high-placed tenor. In fact, that's how I started out singing. After my voice changed, I guess my voice changed maybe I was maybe 15, quite late. Now, nowadays kids' voices are changing when they're 12 years old, it seems. Maybe there's a lot of pressure on them to develop the rewards of adulthood, the car and the girlfriend and whatever. But in my day, I was a boy soprano in church choirs and did a lot of other just solo soprano singing. And when my voice changed, I was probably a kind of second tenor, really. It wasn't particularly high. I remember my own first significant voice teacher I had, I was born in Akron, Ohio, and lived my childhood there. But I studied singing after my voice changed in Cleveland with a very fine teacher whose name is Gretchen Garnett. I think she's still living. And she was questioned fairly recently by somebody who's doing a doctoral dissertation on my career, which is always an honor and nice to have. She was asked a question about what was his voice like when he came to you. And she said, well, he didn't have much of a high voice nor much of a low voice. It was just sort of a middle kind of whatever. But I had some very good advice, she and others, who simply said, sing where it's comfortable. Don't, push yourself into a voice category. The voice is, your body is changing, the voice will change too, and let it change where it wants to go. Don't push it into that. And that's what happened. By the time I went to Juilliard, I was a very high tenor, a naturally high-placed tenor, and I looked for repertoire that used that range of my voice because it was better than the very low stuff. And that's how I got started, but I can't say that's the case with most of the falsetto singers who are singing today. When we first started, which would have been, generally there were just two of us, Alfred Deller, famous English countertenor, or male alto singer, who used his falsetto voice. And he was actually before me, and then I came onto the scene in the early 1950s as a countertenor. And his tradition came from having sung in the alto sections of boy choirs, using his falsetto voice as an adult male to help augment the boy alto sound, which is by its nature quite light and not very penetrating. And many of the English countertenors or alto singers had started out in that tradition, but mine was simply from a tenor standpoint.
Why would you say that, given the number of countertenors we have today, why were there so few? back then, the two of you?
Why were there so few countertenors back when we first started? Well, the repertoire that the countertenors are singing today, of course, it's hard to talk about that because countertenors are singing all sorts of things today. But the Baroque music, you know, Handel and Purcell, and those performances, those things were quite rare. See, what one can sing now, and I don't know that I would be comfortable with my kind of countertenor voice when I was singing. A lot of the castrato arias, castrato things that were virtually impossible, you know, for anybody to handle until some of the falsetto singers today have been able to do, like David Daniels and the Mehta fellow. They're wonderful singers, you know, and they have great voices, and the voice is big enough to fill a big hall. Now, back in Deller's day, in the days when he and I were doing our singing, it was very small time. As far as the falsetto voice goes, it was very quiet, small, artful singing, but it wasn't suitable for any of the great opera things. I think that since opera companies have discovered Handel operas, and there's an audience out there for that music, it's very showy. You know, we have great opera arias that are great things to sing as well as to listen to. And there's an audience for that, and I think they've also got young people interested in that. And it's quite a wonderful phenomenon, I think. And that's one of the reasons why, and I think the opera company, everybody's looking for new things that are going to attract an audience that can be staged and presented. And I think that's another big part of it.
What did you include on your recital?
My recital programs, well, what did I include? A lot of the, certainly the earlier things that I did, it was mostly early music. I'd sing a lot of lute songs. I did a lot of things just with lute accompaniment. Joseph Iadone, who was the only lute player around in those days, who could really cut the mustard with very difficult parts, lute parts to play. And there were always audiences for that. The music is wonderful, very approachable from an audience's standpoint, with absolutely superb English poetry. I loved always singing in English. A lot of singers don't, but I always did. It was something that I couldn't understand, why people didn't want to sing in their own language if they were in fact American or English. I mean, the argument always was, well, Italian has such wonderful vowels. Indeed it does, but we have wonderful vowels in English too. And the development of the interpretive resources of the singer, especially a young singer, should go hand in hand with the development of the voice, is another thing that I'm a stickler about.
You perform leader.
Yes. Well, I should have gone on with that. And when I started out, yeah, I did mostly early music, Baroque and Renaissance music, even some medieval things. And then as I think I was in the process of making some recordings for Decca, and always asked what I wanted to sing. And I said, well, you know, I'd really like to sing some romantic things, you know, some lieder, even though I hadn't really performed it very much at the time. I think I actually made a recording before I'd ever sung it publicly, except when I had been a student back in Juilliard. Those days I sang quite a little bit of lieder. I would always pick those things that were high, that didn't require a lot of transposition up. And indeed, many of the things that I would end up performing with piano accompaniment, as they were originally intended, were in the original keys. They didn't need to be transposed. They were just high tenor things, and I loved doing that. And I did a good bit of Wolf, and I did Schumann, and I remember picking out the Schumann things which I had not sung back in my student days. Again, just by the beauty of the poetry and the beauty of the music and what appealed to me, and that's what I put together. And I would end up a program, having done the first half of the program with either a lute or a harpsichord or both of those instruments, and then after intermission come out and sing things of a later period. And I did, that's sort of forgotten about. People don't think of me as ever having sung anything other than, you know, Handel and Messiahs and things like that. But I did, you know. I wish I had. I never did. It's one of my great regrets that I didn't sing. Again, there were a couple of French songs that I sang when I was a student, but I never felt comfortable with French. It was a language that I liked, and I would love to have worked at it more so that I felt really close to it, not just kind of mouthing the right syllables and singing the way a lot of singers do. It was important to me to really know the language, because those songs, Fauré and Debussy, and they're fabulous, wonderful songs. Ronaldo Hahn, gosh, beautiful. I'd love to have sung that.
So today's countertenor implosion, is this a phase?
Oh, I don't think it's I think it's opening up. You know, I would hesitate. I wouldn't want to think of it as just a phase. I think it's there's a great audience for what those fellows are doing, and they're doing very, very well too. And I give them all kinds of gratitude for what they're able to do these days.
And what is Russell Oberlin doing these days?
Well, it's pretty dolce far niente. I mean, I'm retired. I spend 3 months of the year, sometimes 4, in Venice, where I have a place that I stay and enjoy being there and have many friends. And I'm also have, over the last several years, done a good bit of poetry reading with professional poetry groups, the Lark Ascending one in particular, and we did a lot of Milton and Samson Agonistes and some of just the great things, and other poetry as well as that. And I like doing that.
Not teaching.
I never really have, since I taught for a good many years at Hunter College here, which is part of the City University of New York, in the music department, though I never taught private lessons. I had classroom things. I put together really the program that I wanted to do. I had a repertoire class for singers who studied privately on the outside, and that was always rewarding and satisfying to me. I had some voice classes where I had students who were required to take a certain amount of voice in order to get teaching certificates for, you know, teaching public school or whatever. And that was always very satisfying to me. I had a collegium, which is an early music performance group, mostly singers, but if we had instrumentalists around who played recorders or viols or harpsichords, we would use them as well. And that was, you know, my experience with the Pro Musica gave me a lot of sort of scholarly credentials, at least regarding performance with those various young students, and I enjoyed doing that. But I didn't really teach private lessons. I've always found it what little I've done, very difficult. It's like being a psychiatrist. Everybody's different. You have to deal with an individual, and the individual and the voice are all tied up in one. And I don't think there's any theory that works about teaching somebody to sing, though there would be voice teachers who disagree with that.
Countertenors aside, today's music scene?
Well, I'm not really. Today's music scene, I wish I could say that I was enthusiastic about it. I'd like to say that we're going great guns, but I don't know that we are. I think, there's all the talk about raising money for this hall or for that hall, and refurbishing and building monuments. If we don't do something about public school education, music-wise, there's not going to be any audience down there, as far as I'm concerned. When I've had kids come to Hunter College when I taught there, granted they were not music majors or to begin with, they would come into the department and be required to take one of my classes who had never sung. Never. All they knew was what they heard on television or with their rock records or whatever, and they thought that was singing. And I can remember, I'd give them an assignment where they had to come in and sing something for memory the next class meeting. Anything, it could be whatever. This was the very first session that we were all together. So it can be whatever it wants. It could be the Star Spangled Banner. It's unaccompanied. You just stand up in front of the class and sing. Well, they were terrified, of course, but it's interesting because I had kids come in and they'd sing television commercials. That's what they knew. Made no difference to me. It was just an observation that by the end of that semester, giving them certain kinds of, repertoire that was reasonable for them to learn and that I could deal with. Their favorite songs might well be a Brahms song or a Schubert song, which I was very satisfied with. That was, one of the perks of teaching, that you really could give them something that they would not normally be exposed to, and find out that they really liked it. And I feel to this day that if there was more substantial and good music given to these young people, that the music scene would be very different than it is now. But with the kind of, I hesitate to even call it music, the noise that they're subjected to, and it's pushed at them and peddled at them, they don't have there's nothing else out there for them to be aware of. When we were kids, even though you might not have liked it, you'd turn on the radio and there would be the Bell Telephone Hour, or there would be the Firestone Hour, or relatively good music with some good singing, and nice ballads or whatever. And you developed an appreciation for what a beautiful sound might be, and enjoyed hearing that. The kids nowadays don't have that at all. It just isn't there. And back in those days, even if you didn't end up a singer or end up a musician, you had an appreciation for that kind of music.
Looking back, any regrets?
Any regrets? Well, as we touched on, the French repertoire, I certainly would have liked to have done that. I had a very long career. There are people who say, well, you stopped singing so early. Well, I stopped as a result of having had, hepatitis. And I did a lot of singing for a couple years following that, and I thought, gee, I'm singing too much on the principle of my voice and not on the interest, which I had always. The interest was what I had used always. But getting back to my young singing, I was a boy soprano singer, and I sang, professionally when I was 6 or 7 years old. And people say, "What does professionally mean?" I said, "I got paid. That's it. I wasn't paid a lot of money, but I was paid when I sang, and I didn't have pushy parents at all. It was just I was very, very good." And I regret that I don't have any of those records that were made for radio stations and things like that when I had them all together at one time, and they were put somewhere where they would be safe, and now I can't remember where I put them. Anyway, because they were really very good. It was nice to have that little bit of an archive of one's career. Anyway, I sang all through my childhood, and when I came here to school, I guess it was like 1948, I continued to sing right away. Because of my unusual range, the phone rang. I had a lot of jobs, and I was paid, I started working right away, which is not usual for most of it was always hard to talk to students about, starting a career, because it was easy for me. I didn't do anything. And couldn't have been an easier thing for me to do. But then I sang, for a good, 15 or so years after that, until I was in my early 40s, I think, when I had this hepatitis thing, the results of that, and I decided, well, I really think I'd like to rest. And I was in a position where I could. And I, stopped singing for a year or so. And during that time, I was asked, would I like to do some teaching up at Hunter College? And I said, I remember thinking, what'll I teach? What'll I talk? Because I'd never given it a thought that I'd ever teach. All I had done ever that was very good was singing. I could do other things, but that's what I did that was special. And I was a singer. One feels it. You feel what you are. But I remember going up and having my first classes and deciding, my goodness, I've got a lot to say. I'd be very happy to do this. And I got involved with that and never really got back to doing any singing. But it was like a completely different and new career for me, but I enjoyed doing that. And when I finally retired from Hunter, I was designated Thomas Hunter Professor of Music, which I enjoyed having, and to this day I like to have that title. And so my regrets would be maybe that it would have been nice to sing into your 50s and 60s too. But people say, do you miss it? And I said, if I sang the way I wanted to, I'd sing tomorrow. But if I don't, then I don't want to do it. I don't want to do a lot of singing if I'm not I have to be satisfied with it.